Tyler Hulk, veterinarian here in Iowa. Actually, two questions if we can, but the first one is, we talked about lessons learned from avian influenza. ASF is roaring over in China. I just got back from there last Thursday, and it's much worse than reported. So I agree that's our biggest concern. So my first question is, do we have some lessons learned from PED that we're pretty confident came from China in 2013 and came somehow? Do we have some lessons learned there to keep ASF out from China now?
Sure. So we think about the feed ingredients that come from China and all the travel and all the trade that occurs in the world that we live in today. And as producers, I know several producers that I've been in contact with are starting to think about, well, what is the virus livability time to make the transition from China, for instance, to the United States, and they are extending the amount of time that they might store ingredients in order to hopefully get themselves past that time where that virus could be infective. You might make different choices about terms of where you buy your ingredients, et cetera. Likewise, just if you take that off the table, just the fact that you went to China last week, and you're in the room here with us, did you take good precautions in terms of that travel? And knowing you as I do, I'm sure you did.
I left my shoes in China.
Nice. But the point is that those kinds of practical steps need to be taken every day by all of us, and we need to rethink. We oftentimes buy ingredients based on price, right? And we don't necessarily think about the other costs that could be involved if we make a bad purchase or a bad decision. So those are a couple examples of how producers can adapt.
So related question, if I can, and that probably tie in, maybe Neal, you can jump in too, but so at customs or immigration, so I just came through last Thursday, didn't really feel like there was a whole lot of scrutiny, even though I checked the box, right? So how much engagement do we have with the federal on customs and immigration, or do we know? Do they fully understand the threat that we have, and are they picking up the pace? Because I didn't see it last Thursday when I came back from China.
So when I was on the National Pork Board, I had the chance to tour the Miami Port of Authority. And during that tour, we were at a mail center that receives mail packages from all over the world. We were at the shipping center, and we were at the airport. And I remember walking into the airport's area where they were centered, and here's this table that's about as big as these two tables that are sitting here up in the front, and there were foodstuffs that were just piled high. I mean, the entire table was covered, and the peak of the pile was about 2.5 feet. And we walked in, and we said, "What is this?" And they said, "That's yesterday's take. That's yesterday's take." The point is that there's a customs or an ethnic deal of, especially we were there, I think it was around Christmas time, or I think we were there in December. And so there's this ethnic thing of sending meat products to your family in that particular area of the country. And so people are sending sausages, et cetera, like that. And so you start thinking about FMD, or you think about ASF. That's a great route. And so that's one point. The second point I was making is just think of the sheer volume that they are tasked with at that particular level, and how can they possibly inspect every single item and be diligent enough? We can't expect them to cover everything. It's an impossible task. We have to take responsibility for ourselves as well. Jeff?
Sure, and actually that was a good lead-in, because what I was going to say, there are a lot of discussions. National Pork Board, NPPC, SHIC have all met with the USDA, and there's a lot of discussions. And so I think to answer your question, they're well aware of it. But to follow up what Craig said, I think, and we've been asked at recent meetings, the producers ask what we can do. So I'd say it ties in with what can you do when you cross the border. we all need to control what we can control individually. So, as Craig said, I mean, they're doing the best they can, and it's just like farm workers. You know, some of the people on our farms, we have to train for biosecurity and make sure they understand where the links are, or where the weakest links are, and help them. So it's the same thing here. If we have people on the borders that are doing inspections that may not understand fully what they're doing. So it's our job to help also control what we can. If you're coming across the border, help them and make sure you identify things and don't bring things in that you shouldn't, food. So we all have a part in this.
We also worked with the National Pork Board a few years ago, and we have a couple handouts on that producer biosecurity page if you go to the bottom. One is on if you're hosting international visitors, and the other one is if you're traveling internationally. We're revisiting those, and we're talking about maybe doing a third one for those that are actually know they're on farms or on sites that have the disease, and it may be another step up from even what we have included in that information right now.
It's just good to think of those as redundant measures. So it's no one step will eliminate the risk to zero, but you just have to kind of stack them up on each other. So as was highlighted, the border's the first step, but then producers control what goes on and off their farm. So it's just kind of making those stop gaps. So if one stage fails, there's still steps where it can be caught.
Prior to the ASF outbreak, I was traveling back from China, and I self-reported that I'd been on a hog farm, and I was told that if my shoes didn't have mud on them, then I was good to go, because then they can't transmit disease. But the point I wanted to get out of that was I was talking to one of the senior APHIS officials, and he said if you go through a border crossing and you don't feel like you've been given adequate attention, that it's completely within your purview, and they would encourage you to reach out to the senior management at that border crossing or port of entry and report to them so they can retrain those individuals.
As a follow-up to all this, with the government shutdown, we hear about the TSA agents, maybe that's different than the customs agents, not checking or calling in sick, more days with that. Are we having more things getting by, in our month of shutdown now? Does anybody have any insight on that?
That's unfortunately not something that we have any information on here, but that's, I guess, unfortunately a reality of our political situation right now. So, but again, that's where the redundant systems come into play. So we can't count on things necessarily always being stopped at the border, but we can control what comes in and out of our state and what comes in and off our farms.
If I may, I'd like to reiterate a couple points here. So Pam spoke about the secure pork supply. In the avian industry, they have a thing called National Poultry Improvement Plan, and that's NPIP is kind of the basis for all of the animal health stuff that happens. And that's an industry and governmental partnership, in a sense. And the one thing that the avian industry has in its quiver is the fact that they have an indemnity program in the face of an outbreak. And we have to prove through an audit process that we are taking all of the proper steps in biosecurity in order to be eligible for indemnity in the case of an outbreak when it actually occurs. And so the kinds of tools that Pam was showing there today are instrumental in how we train our employees. We use that kind of material every day. We have the biosecurity officers in place that she has described, and we are continually retraining our staff on biosecurity procedures because we know we have to. So I just want to make sure that we've emphasized, we talk about the things that the government, the things that we can do on our farms are more important than that.
We've got a question right here.
Yeah, well, I maybe have a comment or two questions. One of them is, what's the weakest link? Like you said, in the poultry industry, they've been around the block, they've taken steps. They're being more proactive. I was involved, I'm from Pennsylvania. and I brokered a lot of chicken manure. Well, through that whole process, I haul a lot of manure out of Crider Farms, which is a huge operation there in Lancaster County. And so I saw the fear and the steps that we took to ward that off. I mean, there was millions of dollars at stake for that one operation if they would have contacted it. So that's my one question is, what's the weakest link? What's the first step? What's the best, most effective step? Obviously, it's not going to stop every instance, but is there something that every farm could put into practice that would have a high probability of stopping it? And my second question is, has the industry taken steps to prepare? Like, okay, you said you need that big grinder, you need this pile of chips. Why wouldn't the industry invest in that as a kind of like the military does, or we have stuff sitting there, the grinder's bought, the pile of chips is sitting there, pray to God you never have to use it. But how do you come up with that kind of truckloads of chips overnight? I'm in the transportation industry. 300 and some truckloads of chips in 36 hours? That's staggering, especially in an area where forestry is not a big deal. So I think those are my two questions or comments about the talk. And thank you. I think it's very informative.
Yeah, and I can address your first question, and then let Dr. Benjamin follow up with the second one. But the weakest link is definitely the people movement, as we kind of highlighted in the different presentations. So that harkens back to biosecurity. So with a lot of these outbreaks, it's been people moving the virus themselves, so serving as mechanical vectors. The virus isn't living in people. People aren't producing more virus. They're just carrying it on their clothes, on their body, on their trucks to different farms. So that's the weakest link and our biggest opportunity for any disease, just to stop it from spreading from farm to farm.
So I guess I'd maybe just add to that, though. I think everybody here in this room needs to figure out what the weakest link is. As Craig said, it's hugely important that everybody in here has a biosecurity plan on their farm, and evaluate your biosecurity plan, and you figure out on your farms where the weakest link is. Where do your feed sources come from? We just already hit on issues that we get products from other countries, China. So figure out where your feed comes from. Is that a weak link? Do you have people coming to your farm from foreign countries, travelers? Do you have workers that go to foreign countries? Not only your feed ingredients, but where does your feed supplier deliver feed to? Where's your corn come from? But the big picture is you should have a very good biosecurity plan on your farm and figure out where the weakest links are. So I'd encourage you everybody should have one and figure out where those links are.
As far as the stockpiling of carbon, I think for us, the most realistic thing is probably to look at hay. So we do have some cattle in western Illinois, so that's something we could work with cattle producers to identify sources, and then they could obviously continue to feed that when we don't need it. But as far as the grinder and everything else, I think that's something that we'll have to identify a source ahead of time, but probably won't have locally. It would have to be shipped in.
So USDA has what's called National Veterinary Supply. So they do. So I'm not going to say they've got a bunch of tub grinders, because what happened in AI, got a lot of contractors, hired people to come in with tub grinders to either grind cornstalk bales. There was a huge search for whatever carbon source we could get a hold of, which resulted in some problems, because you went to cities wherever they had piles of trees and ground them up, and sometimes we ended up with huge chunks of wood in compost piles, which didn't work very well. But National Veterinary Stockpile has a lot of resources, USDA, available at least to get an outbreak started, and then you start looking at contracting and other things, because the question always comes up is then who pays for all that equipment sitting there? Is that industry? Is that the federal government? And if they sit there over time and they're not used, upkeep and maintenance becomes an issue. I mean, we have in Iowa 2 foamers now that we didn't have before 2015. National Veterinary Stockpile had foamers, but again, if they sit around for a long time and they're not kept up, it's hard to keep them running then during an outbreak. So I think there are some supplies available ready to get started, but will we need more? Yes, absolutely. And the piece of this that's absolutely critical is the planning ahead of time and the discussions. We might not have all the answers now, but if we keep having these discussions and identify those places where we need more help going forward. That's absolutely critical in this process.
My question would be that I'm in that circle that she pointed in one of those dots, and what can I do besides get a permit to move animals? How long it would take to get that, and if I'm positive, does that just crease the circle out bigger and start killing mine that way? And that spread. And another thing is, if we're talking about AFS, that is one that can be in the manure, it can be in the times, it can be in the compost pile for a period of time, I understand. How long would it be before my neighbor that has it could put pigs back in there so I could operate again?
So there's a whole lot of things there in your questions, and are not easy to answer, but some of the basic things, permit. So if you're an infected premise, nothing's going to move off your farm, so there won't be any permitting. And euthanasia disposal will be the two things, big things quickly we have to resolve. Your neighbors in the control area, that what in Iowa, what we call them is an infected quarantine, infected premise, and then everybody else in the circle is a non-infected quarantine, so they receive a quarantine. Probably the core things that you're going to be required for permitting is what's in the secure food supply plans, secure pork supply plans. Then depending on the disease, to the best of our ability, depending on the disease, we're going to require some form of test. So example today would be as if it happened tomorrow for ASF will probably require a blood test. It'd be whole blood. Hopefully, and there's a lot of work being done, that we could use oral fluids, because the swine industry, oral fluids is huge. But we're going to want to test, if we can, to have some degree of confidence that there's no disease on your farm before we allow permitted movement. Because what everybody has to remember is, when we move those animals, they're going to move next to somebody else. And our number one job, and what sometimes is hard to understand, is ours is to contain the disease, and if we're still in a stamping out and eradicating, we can't move the disease. We have to stop it where it's at. So that's why in the permitting, we're going to go to every extent. If you're a non-infected farm, we're going to make sure to the best of our ability it's still not infected before we make those movements. So time frame. So the meetings Andrew mentioned, it's critical. Come to those meetings, understand further. Permitting is going to be one of those things we talk about. But if you have to do a test, you have to submit it to the lab, and then we get results back, then we issue a permit.
But if you find an affected farm, you probably will have a certain many miles around it that would be tested immediately or all killed anyway, right?
So yes. So yeah. One thing we learned in avian influenza, circles don't always mean everything. We may, so if you're a farm and you are connected to a farm 100 miles away, we may quarantine that farm 100 miles away. Modern agriculture is different. Avian influenza hit, I say, somewhat post early 90s. Modern agriculture changed in those time frames. We're highly mobile, we're highly interlinked, from feed to movements to crews. So the circle is important, but it's also those connections to other farms. So one of the things also producers can help us with, and Pam mentioned it, is things on and off your, we're going to ask you the epidemiological information on your farm. What's been on and off your farm recently, from workers to feed to trucks, all that, because what we need to do also is somewhat of your question is, we have to look forward to other sites that may be infected that we don't know yet. In order to quickly get our arms around a disease, we have to be looking forward and contain the disease as quickly as possible.
You have that authority now, right?
And Andrew mentioned that with Iowa Code Chapter 163. Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone.